Good afternoon. On behalf of the Massachusetts Breast Cancer Coalition, I would like to welcome you to today's webinar, Fluorinated Chemicals in Consumer Products and Drinking Water, Health Concerns and Tips for Reducing Exposure. My name is Michelle Dixon, and I am the Program and Development Coordinator for the Massachusetts Breast Cancer Coalition. And I am pleased that you could join us today for this important topic. I would like to introduce our speaker for today, Dr. Laurel Shader. Dr. Shader is a research scientist at Silent Spring Institute. Her background is in environmental chemistry, environmental engineering, and public health. Before joining Silent Spring Institute, she was a research associate at Harvard School of Public Health. Dr. Shader earned her master's degree and PhD in environmental engineering at the University of California, Berkeley, and a bachelor's degree in environmental engineering science from MIT. Dr. Shader, welcome.
Thank you so much, Michelle. I'd like to thank the Massachusetts Breast Cancer Coalition for organizing today's webinar. And I'd also like to thank State Representative Paul Frost for his efforts helping MBCC to try to obtain funding from the state to support Silent Spring Institute research. And I'd like to thank all of the attendees for joining us today. Today, I will be talking about a class of chemicals of concern called fluorinated chemicals. I'll talk about what they're used for, what are the health concerns, how we're exposed to them in our daily lives, and some steps for reducing our exposure. Lately, fluorinated chemicals have received a lot of national attention in the media, as well as being a class of chemicals of concern among scientists and regulators. Nicholas Kristof, the New York Times columnist, wrote a column last year highlighting the challenges and the concerns around fluorinated chemicals. Lately, my Google alerts have been showing me that there are many articles in the news lately specifically on fluorinated chemicals, many of them focusing on contaminated water. For instance, a town in upstate New York has been shown to have fluorinated chemicals in some of the town's public wells as well as in some private wells, coming from fluorinated chemicals from a plastics manufacturing facility. And the state of New York is planning to test residents in that area for fluorinated chemicals in their blood. In New Hampshire, there's been fluorinated chemicals found in a public supply well at the Pease Air Force Base, where fluorochemicals from firefighting foams contaminated one of the wells there, serving businesses and the daycare. And the state of New Hampshire is conducting biomonitoring and measuring fluorinated chemicals in the blood of residents. And we've heard much about the tragedy in Flint, Michigan, where children have been exposed to high levels of lead caused by accelerated leaching of lead from pipes once the town or the city switched to the Flint River as a source of drinking water. Recently, the state of Michigan also found that the Flint River had elevated levels of fluorinated chemicals as well. So I wanted to spend a moment just to talk about terminology. I've been using the word fluorinated chemicals, and I'll use that for this presentation. It's easier to pronounce. But there's an evolution in terms of the terminology surrounding this class of chemicals. So they are frequently referred to as perfluorinated chemicals, or PFCs. More recently, there's been a shift to expand that to per and polyfluoroalkyl substances, or PFASs. That's kind of a mouthful to say. So others have called them highly fluorinated chemicals. So just be aware that there are different ways of referring to these chemicals, and each term has a slightly different meaning. As an example of what these fluorochemicals look like, the common characteristic of these chemicals is that they have a long carbon chain surrounded by many fluorines. That part of the molecule tends to be more oil soluble, and then there's an end with a charge to it that's more water soluble. What I'm showing in this slide are two of the most frequently tested fluorinated chemicals, PFOS and PFOA, and we'll hear a lot more about them. I did also want to say one more word about terminology, because I have gotten this question about fluoridated water. And it's important to point out that what I'm talking about today are fluorinated chemicals that have many fluorines in the chemical molecule. Fluoridated water is a topic for another day, but refers just to fluoride by itself in the water. So for today's presentation, I'm going to start out with an introduction to Silent Spring Institute. I'm going to talk about what fluorinated chemicals are used for, what are the health concerns as we currently understand them, how are we exposed to fluorinated chemicals in our daily lives, and what are some steps that you can take to reduce exposures in your home. Silent Spring Institute was founded in 1994 by activists at the Mass Breast Cancer Coalition who recognized the need for cancer prevention research. And so our mission is to study links between the environment and women's health, especially breast cancer. And by the environment, we really mean our daily environment. What are the chemicals that we're exposed to in our homes, in our schools, and in our workplaces? Silent Spring Institute is a scientific research organization. We publish peer-reviewed scientific journal articles, and we collaborate with scientists at academic institutions. We also collaborate with activists, physicians, and other nonprofit organizations to conduct research in the public interest. To give you a sense of the types of research conducted by Silent Spring Institute, I have some examples here. In general, much of our work is focused on identifying chemicals that are plausibly linked to breast cancer, and then identifying which ones we're commonly exposed to. So for instance, we have the most extensive list of chemicals that have been shown to cause mammary gland tumors in animal studies. We also study chemical exposures in everyday products, for instance, cleaning products, personal care products, and we measure these chemicals in indoor air and in indoor dust to understand which of the chemicals of concern we are actually being exposed to. The part of the research that I've been working on is focusing on drinking water quality. We've been studying water quality on Cape Cod for almost 20 years, and we've been understanding how hormone-disrupting chemicals and other unregulated contaminants may be making their way from septic systems and other sources and making their way into drinking water. And another area of our research focuses specifically on how we can develop best practices for sharing results with community members and with people who take part in our studies. Our work has been recognized at the national level. This was a Time article that was published last year, or 2 years ago, around a new publication where we compiled information about chemicals linked to mammary gland tumors in animal studies and providing recommendations for how biomonitoring studies can look for these chemicals in study participants. The types of chemicals and products in our daily lives that we focus on include ionizing radiation, gasoline, auto exhaust and air pollution, paint remover and solvents, flame retardants such as brominated flame retardants often used in foam furniture, pesticides, water disinfection byproducts that can form through the chlorination of water, drinking water, and also fluorinated chemicals, which I'll be focusing on today. So I'd like to start out by talking about what fluorinated chemicals are used for. And I wanted to start with a little bit of history. Fluorinated chemicals, the development of fluorinated chemicals started in the early 1900s. And in the late 1930s, a scientist at DuPont was experimenting with fluorinated refrigerant gases and had put some gases in cylinders to sit overnight. And in the morning, he noticed that one of them had turned into a waxy powder. It was very slippery. It had a high melting point. And because it had these very useful properties, it became known as Teflon and was integrated into many products. Similarly, Scotchgard was also developed by accident. A scientist at 3M, actually a woman scientist named Patsy Sherman, was creating fluorinated rubber for jet aircraft fuel lines, and her assistant dropped some of this liquid on his shoe. And they found that the material did not wash off his shoe, but it also didn't discolor it. And they developed many products using this compound to make Scotchgard. So both were discovered by accident. And since that time, since their introduction in the 40s and 50s, many other fluorinated chemicals have been used and incorporated into consumer products. So just to provide some examples, fluorinated chemicals are really everywhere in our daily lives. So stain-resistant carpets and furniture, such as those treated with Stainmaster or Scotchgard, contain fluorinated chemicals. Similarly, waterproof apparel containing Gore-Tex also has fluorinated chemicals. Other examples include certain floor waxes and ski waxes, non-stick cookware that contains Teflon, certain grease-proof food packaging, such as microwave popcorn bags, pizza boxes, and fast food wrappers. And even certain types of dental floss also contain Teflon. So fluorinated chemicals represent a wide range of chemicals. And just like in a family, there are many shared characteristics among all the members of the family, but there are certain unique characteristics for each one. So fluorinated chemicals are not naturally occurring in the environment. They are extremely persistent in the environment. The carbon-fluorine bonds are very strong and very hard to break. So the fluorinated compounds are persistent even at high temperatures. And because they have that combination of having oil repellency and water repellency, they have many applications for repelling grease and water. In addition to the consumer product applications that I've mentioned, they are also commonly used in certain firefighting foams used to fight oil and gasoline fires. So in around the early 2000s, scientists began to realize that fluorinated chemicals, through their widespread use all around the globe, were ending up in wildlife as well. And in particular, PFOS, which was the active ingredient in old formulations of Scotchgard, was found to be present in wildlife throughout the world. In general, the highest levels of fluorinated chemicals in wildlife are found in close proximity to urban areas. It makes sense that near production facilities and near areas where they're used, there's more contamination of water and soil. However, high levels have also been found in polar bears and in other Arctic wildlife. Certain forms of fluorinated chemicals are volatile, and they can travel through the air from lower latitudes and then condense in the colder Arctic air and end up in the water in the Arctic and end up moving up the food chain. So we know that these chemicals are present in our daily environment. We know they can end up in wildlife. What are the health concerns for people? So we know that basically all Americans are exposed to fluorinated chemicals. Biomonitoring by the U.S. Centers for Disease Control and Prevention have shown that over 99% of Americans carry fluorinated chemicals in their blood. In particular, PFOS and PFOA can remain in the body for years. Their half-life, so the amount of time it takes to excrete half of your body burden, is on the order of years for PFOS and PFOA. There have been many studies of the health effects of PFOS and PFOA in laboratory studies. We know far less about other fluorinated chemicals. For PFOS and PFOA, laboratory studies have shown links to liver, testicular, and pancreatic cancer, enlargement of the liver. Of particular concern for our Silent Spring Institute, as a breast cancer research organization, PFOA has been linked to mammary gland tumors and to altered breast development in animal studies. And there have also been effects shown on the immune system and changes in cholesterol. In terms of health effects studied directly in people, much of what we have learned about PFOA health effects came from a health study near a DuPont facility in West Virginia. The drinking water was contaminated with PFOA, and a health study has evaluated the health effects for local residents. These studies have shown probable links to high cholesterol, thyroid disease, testicular and kidney cancer, pregnancy-induced hypertension, and ulcerative colitis. Work in the Faroe Islands has also shown toxicity to the immune system of children. So concerns about the toxicity and persistence of PFOS and PFOA have led to reductions in the production of these chemicals. So in the year 2000, 3M phased out its production of PFOS. In 2006, EPA developed a stewardship program to phase out PFOA production. And the Stockholm Convention for Persistent Organic Pollutants includes PFOS, which was added in 2009. PFOA has also been proposed to be added. It's important to note that while the production of PFOS and PFOA has been phased out in the U.S., production still occurs globally. The EPA has set provisional guidelines for levels of PFOS and PFOA in drinking water, but they are not currently regulated in drinking water. So as often happens when chemicals of concern are replaced with other chemicals, we frequently don't know the health effects of what the substitution chemicals are. So we know that PFOS and PFOA are being phased out, and they're being replaced with fluorinated chemicals that are less persistent in people's bodies. But they're still persistent in the environment, and the health effects really have not been well studied. We see in the lower left that levels of PFOS in blood samples in the U.S. population have been going down in recent decades, but we see that PFNA, which is one of the substitute compounds, it's a longer chain version of PFOA, levels are increasing. So we know that fluorinated chemicals are found in many household products. How are we actually exposed to them? Well, there are a number of pathways by which fluorinated chemicals can enter our bodies. So because fluorinated chemicals are found in soil, air, and water, they can make their way into plants and animals and thus enter the food chain. Some fluorinated chemicals, like PFOS, do increase in concentration in the same way that methylmercury does. So higher level fish tend to have the PFOS. However, because of the complicated chemistry of many of the fluorinated chemicals, it can be difficult to predict which types of food have the highest levels. The widespread use of fluorinated chemicals in food packaging can be another source of exposure. We know that some of those fluorinated chemicals can migrate into the food that they are being used to package. Drinking water is another source of exposure, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. In areas where drinking water is heavily contaminated, we expect that drinking water would be the most important exposure pathway. Another important area of research right now underway is to evaluate exposures to fluorinated chemicals through products in our homes. By having stain-resistant carpets or waterproof apparel, fluorinated chemicals can make their way into household dust and into air. And there's also the potential for direct contact through touching products and then ingesting fluorinated chemicals on people's hands. However, at this point, it's really an active area of research to understand which pathways of exposure are most important and how best to take steps to reduce our family's exposures. So I wanted to spend a few moments specifically talking about drinking water. I mentioned that there was a health study that had been conducted near a DuPont facility in West Virginia. Residents in this area filed a lawsuit because they were concerned about health effects associated with the PFOA, also known as C8, in their drinking water. And I think it's rare in cases of chemical exposures for lawsuits to bring around scientific studies. This has happened in the realm of tobacco lawsuits, where DuPont actually funded an extensive study called the C8 Study Panel, which included 3 independent scientists who evaluated health effects in the local residents and recreated exposures in drinking water. Their task was to evaluate 55 different health outcomes and to determine which ones were more probably than not linked to the PFOA in their drinking water. So through this independent scientific review, 6 outcomes have been linked more probably than not to PFOA. These include high cholesterol, thyroid disease, testicular and kidney cancer, high blood pressure in pregnant women, and ulcerative colitis. So the highest levels of contamination of drinking water have been found near production facilities and other manufacturing sites. Those firefighting foams that contain fluorinated chemicals are also significant sources of groundwater and surface water contamination, particularly near Air Force bases and airports, where they have been used to fight fires, say when an airplane crashes, and also as part of training activities. Wastewater is another source of fluorinated chemicals into the environment. Traces of fluorinated chemicals can wash off of the products that we have in our home and end up in wastewater. In addition, industrial wastewater can contain elevated levels of fluorinated chemicals. So both sewage treatment plants and septic systems are additional sources of environmental contamination. Finally, landfills can also be sources. Think of throwing away treated carpets that have Scotchgard or other stain-resistant coatings. Those chemicals can leach off over time and have been found at elevated levels in landfill leachate. Silent Spring Institute has been studying fluorinated chemicals and other emerging contaminants of concern on Cape Cod. In 2010, we released a study where we investigated emerging contaminants in 20 public drinking water wells. And we were evaluating the role of septic systems and other pollution sources as sources of contamination to drinking water on the Cape. As part of that study, we tested 20 wells for PFOS and PFOA. We found that 8 of the wells that we tested had detectable levels of PFOS present at over 1 part per trillion concentration. We also found PFOA in several of the wells that we tested. So looking at the concentrations here, I'm just showing these on a scale that goes by orders of magnitude. 12 of the wells that we tested did not have detectable levels in our study. There were some wells that had lower levels of detection, which is consistent with septic systems or discharges from wastewater treatment plants being sources. And then we also saw that there was one well in the Hyannis water system that was much higher than the others. And that well is located near an airport and near commercial activity. And so we were able to identify a range of sources that were contributing to the PFASs in the drinking water supply. As a point of reference, our highest level that we detected was 100 nanograms per liter, or parts per trillion. The EPA has a provisional health advisory for PFOS of 200 nanograms per liter. So it was about half of the health advisory. So it definitely raised some concerns about the potential for firefighting foams and other sources to contaminate drinking water wells. After our study came out, we've been told that the local fire training academy stopped using or developed a policy to stop using fluorinated chemicals as part of their local training. We subsequently also studied private wells on Cape Cod. We tested for a wider range of fluorinated chemicals. This is 14 different fluorinated chemicals we tested for. And we found 5 of them in at least half of the wells we tested. We wanted to evaluate what the possible sources of these perfluorinated chemicals might be. And when we look at water with higher levels of nitrate, as we move from the left to the right of the screen, we see that the levels of the fluorinated chemicals increased. So that is consistent with septic systems being a source, because we know that septic systems are the primary source of nitrate into groundwater on Cape Cod. However, when we look at all of our data, we did see that there were 2 wells that had that sort of deviated from this relationship, where we saw much higher levels than we might have expected based on the levels of nitrate. And we know that other sources of fluorinated chemicals can include landfill leachate and commercial wastewater. So currently, there are no drinking water standards in the US for fluorinated chemicals. That means that public water suppliers don't have to test for them on a regular basis. However, the EPA did include 6 fluorinated chemicals as part of a nationwide monitoring of unregulated contaminants, what's called UCMR3, to get a sense of the levels of fluorinated chemicals more broadly throughout the US. This helps their decision-making about whether to actually regulate fluorinated chemicals in drinking water. Through that nationwide monitoring, several other wells in the Hyannis water system were found to have PFOS above the EPA health advisory. In response to that testing, the town took those wells offline and installed activated carbon treatment to remove the perfluorinated chemicals that they detected. Throughout the state of Massachusetts, other water supplies also took part in this nationwide monitoring for fluorinated chemicals. This nationwide testing included all large water suppliers, serving over 10,000 people, and 2% of small water supplies. So in Massachusetts, 165 supplies were tested for fluorinated chemicals. And 5 of these supplies had detectable levels of fluorinated chemicals show up at least once during the course of the testing. In addition to Hyannis, this included water samples tested in Danvers, Hudson, Mashpee, and Westfield. I would like to point out that the UCMR3 testing did not have very sensitive methods and very low detection limits. So only about 1% of samples in the US showed up as having levels of PFCs that were detectable through the UCMR testing. However, we know that lower levels are very likely to be found in other drinking water supplies. So it's important to keep in mind that other water supplies in Massachusetts likely also contain fluorinated chemicals at lower levels. So we know that fluorinated chemicals can be found in drinking water, but I said also that we don't have any enforceable drinking water standards. So how do we evaluate risk and know what's a safe level? The EPA has developed guidelines for PFOS and PFOA. So these are developed to be recommendations, but they are not enforced in the same way that drinking water standards are for other pollutants. There's kind of a lack of consistency, though, in what the actual level should be. So the level for PFOA developed by the EPA in 2009 is 400 parts per trillion. However, other states have developed guidelines that are more protective or have lower levels than the EPA guideline. So the Minnesota guideline has the state of Minnesota guideline of 300 parts per trillion, and the state of New Jersey developed a guideline of 40 parts per trillion. The EPA is currently considering a lower level of 100 parts per trillion as its health advisory. The 400 parts per trillion was developed for exposures over a short period of time, and they're currently developing a guideline to reflect lifetime chronic exposure. So it's important to take away from this that there is no single bright red line in terms of what is a safe level, and our understanding of the science and of the health effects is constantly evolving. In addition to drinking water, there's a lot of active research underway to characterize the relative contributions of food, consumer products, and drinking water. In general, it appears that food is the major source of exposure, except in cases where drinking water has high levels. However, exposures through consumer products in the home have not been well characterized. And I'd like to mention a study that was published in the journal Environmental Science and Technology that found exceptionally high levels of PFHXS, it's a shorter chain version of PFOS, in a Canadian family where carpets had been treated with Scotchgard 8 times over the course of 15 years. So we know that in homes where these products are used, they don't just stay in the products, and there's the potential for them to migrate out of the products and into our bodies. So what can you do to reduce your exposure to fluorinated chemicals? Unfortunately, in many cases, it's hard to know which products contain fluorinated chemicals because they're not usually included on packages for products. But here are some tips that we can recommend. One thing you can do is to avoid stain-resistant carpets and upholstery because the coatings that are used on these products often contain fluorinated chemicals. You can look for words such as perfluoro, polyfluoro, or PTFE on product labels. You can select cast iron or enamel cookware to avoid Teflon in cookware. Eating more fresh foods will reduce the possibility of fluorinated chemicals migrating from fast food packaging. You can minimize your contact with fluorinated ski waxes. And if your local water supply does contain elevated levels of fluorinated chemicals, you can filter them out of your water with an activated carbon filter. And I think overall, an approach is just to ask yourself, do I really need this product to have fluorinated chemicals? There may be certain applications that are hard to replace, but are there others that are easier to replace? And I wanted to end with an example from a retail chain in Denmark. The largest retailer in Denmark had stopped selling microwave popcorn because the suppliers couldn't make the packaging without fluorinated chemicals, and they didn't find that it was acceptable to sell products that had fluorinated chemicals in the packaging. And because they had stopped selling these products, there was actually motivation for packagers to come up with packaging that would work for microwave popcorn that didn't contain fluorinated chemicals. So late last year, there was a Spanish supplier that had found that they could process natural cellulose in a different way that would make it resistant to the heat of cooking microwave popcorn. And it's interesting because it shows that manufacturers and consumers often can take the lead in changing formulations of products ahead of changes in legislation. So with that, I'd like to close, but I do want to let you know some more resources that you can learn about Silent Spring Institute research and also learn more tips about reducing your exposure to chemicals of concern. Our website is silentspring.org. You can learn about all of our different research areas, and we have an online resource called Too Close to Home, which has information about our research studies and tips that you can use. I'd also like to recommend trying out our new smartphone app called Detox Me, which is a fun way to learn about chemicals in our daily environment and provides incentives to take steps to reduce our exposure. So with that, I'd like to close. Again, I appreciate Massachusetts Breast Cancer Coalition organizing today's event, and I look forward to hearing questions.
Wonderful. Thank you, Laurel. I'd like to open it up to our attendees. If you have a question, please feel free to type it in, and we can share it here. Laurel, I guess I will start. I have a question in just trying to understand how do we, as consumers, go about moving the needle with manufacturers or with our local governments in terms of making this a priority?
Yeah, that's a great question. You know, a lot of times it's been manufacturers and retail chains that have been ahead of the legislation. So consumers can let their their product producers know that they don't want to have products that contain these harmful additives. There's a lot of push at the national level to reform the Toxic Substances Control Act. That's currently somewhere between the House and the Senate, and it's not clear at this point what the final version of that bill might look like. Ultimately, it makes sense to have a system where chemicals are tested for safety before they're put into widespread production. But our system often works the other way around, and it can be really challenging to, as a consumer, to know what to avoid because, again, these products aren't labeled in many cases.
And I do actually have a question from someone who wanted to know, are takeout coffee cups, do they have these PFOs that you referred to?
That's a great question, and that's actually an area of research that we have underway right now. We are doing testing for fluorinated chemicals in fast food packaging, including cups. This is a collaboration with the Green Science Policy Institute, Environmental Working Group, and researchers at Hope College in Michigan. So we'll have some more answers about that. I've so far heard conflicting information about whether cups contain fluorinated chemicals.
And another question has come in. How effective are town water filtration plants, that in particular the ones that utilize ozonation in order to remove some of the wood carbon fibers? So, how are they in terms of dealing with the PFCs?
Oh, that's a good question. The level of removal that you see depends on the type of treatment placed. My understanding is that, for instance, chlorination does not really remove fluorinated chemicals. I don't know specifically about ozonation, but most water supplies that have elevated levels of fluorinated chemicals, in order to remove them, turn to activated carbon to physically separate out the fluorinated chemicals. Something like ozonation might lead to transformations of one fluorinated chemical to another, but would not, I don't think, break down the fluorinated chemicals entirely.
Okay. And related to that, a question has come in regarding your home water filtration systems, Brita, for example. How effective, I know that you said that was one element that we could look at with using filtered water. Are these products that we buy, like a Brita water system, are they effective at removing these compounds?
So in general, products that contain activated carbon are effective at removing fluorinated chemicals such as PFOS and PFOA. Activated carbon can be found in different types of home filtration systems. So some filters have a solid carbon block filter. These are often the ones that are found under your sink where you have a separate tap for drinking water. Those are effective. The filter pitchers that contain granular activated carbon also can reduce the levels of fluorinated chemicals.
Great.
In general, the solid carbon block filters are thought to do somewhat of a better job in general of removing contaminants just because they have more surface area than those larger pieces of activated carbon. But they both have the same, they work on the same basic principle.
Okay, good to know. And I do have a question coming in that asks what kinds of, it kind of leads back to my first question, what kind of advocacy efforts are going on in Massachusetts and nationally that people can become involved in?
That's a great question. I know Environmental Working Group has done a lot on fluorinated chemicals. They had a report that came out last year specifically looking at PFOA. And recently the FDA announced a ban on certain fluorinated chemicals in food packaging. My understanding is that those were fluorinated chemicals that were not currently being used that much, that they were already being phased out. And I don't know if there are any campaigns currently underway to address other types of fluorinated chemicals that are commonly used in food packaging. But I would check with Environmental Working Group or Safer Chemicals as organizations that develop campaigns around chemicals such as perfluorinated chemicals.
Okay, and I have a question for you about dental floss. This caught one of our attendees by surprise, and me as well, when you had that listed as one of the products to be aware of. And so the question is there a safer alternative? Is there another option? And could you expand on the dental floss just a little bit?
My understanding is that Oral-B Glide, that flat ribbony dental floss, is the type of dental floss that contains Teflon. To my knowledge, other types of dental floss do not.
Okay, well that's helpful to know. Thank you. And I'll leave it open for one more minute if we have any more questions. Okay, well I want to, on behalf of Cheryl Osimo, Executive Director of the Massachusetts Breast Cancer Coalition, and our entire Board of Directors, I want to thank Dr. Shader for this invaluable information. And I want to thank all of you for joining us today. Thank you and have a good afternoon.
Thank you, Michelle. Thanks, everyone.